Very useful. So to round out the picture, Felice, I want to ask you a couple of things. Jerry has just said that for Chinese decision makers and opinion makers, foreign relations and international relations is secondary to local politics. And yet we see China having growing influence in the world. It may not be primary to them, but they're such a big player, and they're playing a bigger role on the international stage. So two things really on the human rights front. One, we're now 65 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. To what extent is China's own domestic experience and the way it manifests itself globally affecting the integrity and maintenance of a set of human rights universal standards that are exemplified by the Universal Declaration and everything that's followed? How much are they having an impact on the standard setting? Secondly, implementation. You and I were just talking about some of the treaty bodies and some of the ways in which they've been weakened. Where's China fit into the international system in that regard? And then more broadly, how is China's role being felt on the global stage in places like Syria, Iran, and elsewhere, where human rights issues are being discussed and where China's role is significant? So both standard setting and implementation.
Well, thank you, Mike. China's involvement with the United Nations and with the world on issues of human rights has progressed. We really have seen changes. A country which followed Deng Xiaoping's advice, calmly observe, cherish obscurity, is now often in a leadership role that no one ever imagined. And we have seen, and I won't say that this is necessarily a positive one. What China has done is it has embraced universality and attempts to redefine what universality is. It's a good political lesson. We all know this. It contests it. And yet, when challenged, China doesn't want to be alone. So China has joined the world in the Vienna World Conference in affirming that universality is absolute, although historical and regional and cultural and religious factors have to be taken into account. Human rights is the first responsibility of governments, and universality must be followed. Well, that's a really important development. They ratified 7 of 10 major treaties. Those ratifications have often come with engagement to try to change what is the universal reach and what are the standards that are involved. They have always emphasized a hierarchy of rights. They've always emphasized economic, social, and cultural rights over civil and political rights, solidarity rights, and they sneak in the argument that you can only implement rights when your level of development is high enough to implement the rights. So it's sort of an economic and social rights approach to gradual relevance and impact, and it's at the same time a very clear indication that civil and political rights issues will only go so far. And of course, they're not party to the Civil Political Covenant. They signed it after tremendous efforts by John Shattuck and your predecessor some years back, 15 years ago, but they have not yet ratified it. They're still studying it and refining laws and, I suppose, looking for some quid pro quo. Chinese also emphasize collective rights over individual rights, solidarity rights as well. And in that process, they have tended to not just join with, but in some cases lead on issues together with Cuba, together with a number of other countries that don't want to see strong mechanisms, country-specific scrutiny, or independent information sources in the UN system. And what's interesting is that during your term, if I can turn the tables here a little bit, Mike, during your term as Assistant Secretary, they stepped up in front and organized and led a coalition in the UN on political protests. Another one on the use of the internet, saying it shouldn't be used for terrorism and things of that sort. That kind of leadership was something that they didn't do, but they felt obliged by the Arab Spring, I guess, to think back to Poland, think back to 1989, and say proactively, we're in the system, we're in these treaty bodies, we're in the Human Rights Council, we want to shape it in the way we want to shape it. Another of your predecessors told me how the U.S., this is in the Bush administration, would go forward with the China resolutions that had been dropped at the end of the Clinton administration. And he said the Chinese would come to them and say, if you raise this, you will be alone. And your predecessor said back, we know that, and we don't really care. And he said that drove them crazy, because one of their approaches is also to work together with others and to build those coalitions. So what we see is a tendency to do everything by consensus, and a tendency in the Human Rights Council and other bodies to try to build this kind of support, and a rather feeble response by what I would call the pro-human rights countries, the pro-civil political rights countries, in saying, wait a minute, we won't have that. They're willing to do it in private. They're willing to talk about it in private. That's what the Chinese want. They come and they say, the Chinese leaders went around Geneva before the first Universal Periodic Review, second one's coming up in September. Before the first periodic review, they went around and they said, we'll raise any issue you want to raise with us, but do it in private. The rest of the world has basically said okay, and has engaged in dialogues and private discussion and so forth. What we aren't seeing is that public opposition quite the way we would hope to see. And the result of that, it seems to me, is we look weak, they feel safe, and they can ignore human rights issues, ignore important cases like Chen's nephew. There seems to be an ability to just brush these things off. And so I think we're seeing long-term strategy on the Chinese side of cherishing obscurity but using visibility when needed. And we're seeing no strategy or no visible strategy on the other side. And you know, there's an old, I'll stop with this, there's an old saying that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
I like it.
We may be in that phase. I hope not.
I want to put the international discussion in a little bit broader context relating to Chinese views of international law and how they are evolving. Of course, as I point this out, I have to think of what Robert Burns admonished us so many years ago in his poem, "Oh, would the Lord this gift he give us to see ourselves as others see us." The U.S. is sitting here, as China pointed out again the other day, in judgment on China and human rights, and we try to forget all the things in our newspaper that the rest of the world doesn't forget. They know what we've been up to. It's like this cyber attack business. Of course, China's been attacking us in so many ways, but we read very little about what have we been doing. All of that is kept quiet. Even the New York Times and other Washington Post, Wall Street Journal don't seem to be pushing us. What are we up to? Chinese know what we're up to. They know what we've been up to with respect to international law, including those occasions when we've thumbed our nose at it or refused to take part in various things. So that's just the background. But in terms of what's going on in China, you could say until now there have been two big periods of China and international law. One prior to 1971, People's Republic was established in 49. For a little over 2 decades, excluded from representation in the UN, and very much preaching revolutionary international law, a rival organization to the UN, revolution in various countries. That ended when China finally was allowed to be represented by the People's Republic, as it should have been in 1950. Since then, since 71, we've seen 4 decades of increasing participation, as Felice just said, in various international organizations, etc. Increasing sophistication, doing what every great nation state does, trying to shape the existing international norms and institutions in a way to favor its own foreign policy, playing the game and playing it increasingly skillfully. Coming to terms with equality, universality, etc. Lately, I've seen some disturbing signs. So far, there are only some signs. It's not consistent. That maybe China is thinking about entering a third stage, one where it has exaggerated notions of sovereignty, one that would hearken back to the historians reminding us of the traditional East Asian relationship where China was at the top and the peripheral states all paid tribute to it. We've seen, for example, when Australia had a dispute with China over the interpretation of its consular agreement. Australia said it had the right to send consuls to a secret trial of Stern Hu, Australian national of Chinese descent. China could have argued, as it should have, even if it didn't have the better argument. The treaty would have permitted its excluding consuls from trials in secret cases. But it didn't. It just brushed aside the agreement and said, nothing can intervene, nothing can interfere with the exercise of our judicial sovereignty. Apparently not even an agreement China made in the exercise of its sovereignty, just brushing it aside in the name of some exaggerated notion of sovereignty. Or look at the law of the sea problem. Tomorrow we'll have the Solicitor General of the Philippines come and talk to us about the Philippines bringing an arbitration against China over China's exaggerated claims to the law of the sea, under the law of the sea in the South China Sea. Well, under the treaty that China freely adhered to, the UNCLOS, it's obligated to go to international dispute resolution to solve it. But when the Philippines brought this claim, China just brushed it aside, said it was a hostile act, wouldn't tolerate this. Very different from the Chinese view toward the WTO. China, as we saw in our international law class yesterday, has taken part. When it signed on to the WTO entry, it signed on to its dispute resolution procedures. And it's participating, winning some, losing some, but taking part. But that hasn't been its recent response on the law of the sea, which is comparable, also compulsory dispute resolution procedures, but this time they just set it aside. So we're worrying whenever I hear a Chinese leader give a speech saying China will not have to succumb to Western values and all this, as though China hadn't signed up to all these major human rights treaties, even though it hasn't ratified the ICCPR. It's ratified an amazing number of documents, I think more than the United States has at this point. But there's a danger here as China grows and as the leaders maybe aren't sufficiently sensitive or to act like another great continental power that's rising and can just wave its hand against the rules of the game. I hope that's not going to happen. But that's part of the background of what we're talking about.